The Goblin Emperor, Katherine Addison. This is courtly fantasy with a humane tone, a contained political setting, and a reading experience built on patience rather than spectacle. If you loved fantasy as a kid because it made the world feel kinder and more meaningful, this is the adult upgrade I would place first. The book is not trying to recreate a magic school or a quest party. It offers a more grown-up pleasure. Watching careful choices, social pressure, etiquette, loneliness, and decency matter inside a formal court. That makes it useful for readers who grew up on Wonder but no longer want a story that feels written for 12-year-olds. Katherine Addison is the pen name used by Sarah Monette for this novel, and that small publishing fact is helpful because it signals how deliberately the book presents itself as its own kind of fantasy. The appeal is not giant battles or lore homework. The appeal is emotional intelligence. Read this if you want fantasy that still feels generous, but with adult restraint, social texture, and quieter stakes. It is the safest first step in this starter pack because it proves that adult fantasy can be warm without becoming childish. The Curse of Chalion, Lois McMaster Bujold. This is thoughtful secondary world fantasy with a reflective tone, a mature court setting, and a calm sense of spiritual and political weight. This is the book I would choose for someone who misses old-fashioned fantasy, but wants the emotional center to feel older. It has the shape of classic fantasy, without the feeling of a children's adventure. The prose is clear. The world feels lived in. The questions are more about service, duty, recovery, and wisdom than about collecting powers or racing through a map. Lois McMaster Bujold is famous in both science fiction and fantasy, which matters because her work often combines strong character focus with very clean story architecture. For adult readers returning to fantasy, that combination reduces friction. You do not need to memorize a giant glossary before the book starts working. You can settle into the voice, notice how the politics and beliefs fit together, and let the experience deepen gradually. This belongs in the list because it keeps the dignity of older fantasy while removing some of the stiffness that can make older books hard to begin. If you want fantasy that feels wise rather than loud, start here. The Name of the Wind, Patrick Rothfuss. This is lyrical epic fantasy with a storyteller's voice, a reflective frame, and a reading experience that many people remember for atmosphere. This is the adult path for readers who love the feeling of being pulled into a legendary life, but now want language, music, memory, and longing to carry more of the weight. It is part of an unfinished fantasy series, so the commitment is different from a standalone recommendation. The series is also famously unfinished, and that is important to say clearly because a beginner guide should reduce regret. Even with that caveat, the first book remains one of the most common adult fantasy gateways because it gives readers a strong voice immediately. It feels intimate before it feels enormous. It cares about reputation, craft, performance, learning, and self-mythology. For adults who grew up loving fantasy heroes, this can be powerful because it treats the idea of a legend with more ambiguity and more texture. Do not choose it first if an unfinished series will frustrate you. Choose it first if prose, mood, and the romance of storytelling matter more than closure right now. The Lies of Locke Lamora, Scott Lynch. This is fast adult fantasy with a criminal crew atmosphere, a vivid city setting, and a reading experience built on cleverness. This is the pick for adults who loved childhood fantasy because it felt adventurous, but who now want sharper dialogue, rougher consequences, and more street-level energy. The useful thing about this book is that it does not ask you to love prophecy, chosen one structure, or ancient lore before it begins to move. It starts with voice, social games, disguises, friendship, confidence, and danger at human scale. Scott Lynch's debut became a major gateway for readers who wanted fantasy that felt less like a royal quest and more like a polished caper inside an invented world. That makes it especially good for people who drifted away from fantasy because the genre began to feel too ceremonial. Here, the pleasure is momentum. The setting is rich, but it does not feel like homework. There is a series after it, yet the first book is often read as a satisfying entry on its own terms. Start here if you want the old thrill of adventure with an adult sense of wit and risk. The City of Brass, S.A. Chakraborty. This is historical fantasy with a mythic tone, a layered city setting, and a reading experience shaped by culture and power. If childhood fantasy gave you wonder through castles, forests, maps, and secret worlds, this book offers a more adult version through history, belief, trade, family pressure, and political identity. It begins the day of a bad trilogy, so it is a series entry rather than a one-book stop. That is not a problem if you want a new world to live in for a while. It is a problem only if you want zero commitment. S.A. Chakraborty built the series from traditions and historical textures that are less common in the most familiar English-language fantasy starter lists. That gives the book a strong reason to be here. It expands your sense of what fantasy can feel like after the childhood canon. The magic is not just decoration. The city is not just a backdrop. The social layers matter. Choose this when you want wonder, but you want that wonder tied to adult questions about belonging, loyalty, inheritance, and power. It also helps readers who want magic to feel rooted in memory, language, and community rather than only in rules. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, Susanna Clarke. This is literary historical fantasy with an elegant 19th century texture, a dry wit, and a slow immersive reading experience. This is not the easiest book on the list, but it may be the most interesting adult upgrade if you want magic to feel scholarly, social, old and slightly unsettling. Susanna Clarke's novel is famous for its faux historical style and extensive footnotes. That fact matters because the book is not just telling a fantasy story, it is imitating the shape of a whole magical history. For adults who love the feeling of secret lore as children, this can be deeply satisfying because the lore has texture, documents, manners, arguments, and academic fussiness. The friction is length. This is a large book, and it rewards patience more than speed. Do not start here if you need a quick win. Start here if you miss the feeling that a fictional world might have libraries behind it. It is a standalone, which helps. You can take one long journey without signing up for a shelf of sequels. Its length becomes easier if you treat it as a season of reading, rather than a weekend challenge. The Goblin Emperor, Catherine Addison. This is humane court fantasy with a contained scope, a formal setting, and a reading experience that turns kindness into tension. The first transition path is for adults who still want comfort from fantasy, but no longer want comfort to mean simple. Pair this path mentally with the Curse of Chalion. Together they show two adult ways to preserve the emotional shelter that childhood fantasy often provided. The Goblin Emperor is gentler and more intimate. The Curse of Chalion feels older, more reflective, and more spiritually weighted. Neither book depends on shock or spectacle to prove it is adult. That is the useful lesson. Adult fantasy does not have to become grim to become serious. It can grow up by adding restraint, consequence, self-knowledge, and social complexity. This path is best for readers who are coming back after years away from fantasy. It is also best for readers who feel tired by endless lore. Start with the Goblin Emperor if you want the softest landing. Move to the Curse of Chalion if you want the same calm maturity with a more classic fantasy frame. The Lies of Locke Lamora, Scott Lynch. This is fast-moving adult fantasy, with a vivid city, a crew-driven feel, and a reading experience closer to a caper than a quest. The second transition path is for adults who miss the energy of childhood fantasy, the feeling of plans, danger, friends, skill, and forward motion. This path also points toward The Name of the Wind, but for a different reason. The Lies of Locke Lamora gives you social energy and pace. The Name of the Wind gives you voice and memory. Both are useful when old fantasy feels too plain, but huge modern epics feel too heavy. The choice comes down to what you want your momentum to feel like. If you want clever scenes and city pressure, go with Locke Lamora. If you want a narrator spell and a more reflective pull, go with The Name of the Wind. The caveat is commitment. Both books open series, and one of those series is unfinished. That does not make them bad starting points. It means you should choose them with your eyes open. This path is for readers who want adult fantasy to move. That makes it useful for former young fantasy fans who now want momentum without losing texture. The City of Brass, S.A. Chakraborty. This is mythic historical fantasy with a rich city setting, layered social tensions, and a reading experience built around discovery. The third transition path is for adults who miss the secret world feeling of childhood fantasy, but want that feeling enlarged by culture, history, and adult complexity. The City of Brass and Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell both work here, though they work in opposite ways. The City of Brass gives you a living city with political pressure and a trilogy shape. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell gives you a literary alternate history with footnotes, manners, and a slow archive-like texture. Choose the City of Brass if you want movement through a world that feels socially alive. Choose Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell if you want the strange pleasure of reading as if magic had its own national history. This path is not about speed first. It is about enlarging your idea of fantasy. Childhood fantasy often opens a door. These books make the room beyond the door feel older, stranger, and more complicated. The Name of the Wind, Patrick Rothfuss. This is lyrical series fantasy, with a strong narrative voice, a reflective tone, and a reading experience that depends on mood. The biggest mistake adults make after loving fantasy as kids is choosing a book for reputation alone. A famous adult fantasy book can still be the wrong first book for your current stamina. The Name of the Wind is beautiful for many readers, but it also carries the unfinished series caveat. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is brilliant for the right mood, but its length and literary style can feel slow if you need a quick return to reading. The City of Brass is a strong first step if you want a trilogy, but it is not the lightest option if you wanted a single volume. None of that is criticism. It is decision clarity. If you are rebuilding reading momentum, start with the book that matches your energy rather than the one that looks most important online. If you are tired, choose The Goblin Emperor or The Curse of Chalion. If you are restless, choose The Lies of Locke Lamora. If you want immersion, choose one of the bigger worlds and accept the slower ramp. The Curse of Chalion, Lois McMaster Bujold. This is mature fantasy with clear prose, a thoughtful structure, and a reading experience that rewards calm attention. Treat this list as a starter pack, not as a required syllabus. The best profit-friendly recommendation for the viewer is also the best reader-friendly recommendation. Buy or borrow one book first. Do not turn nostalgia into a 6-book obligation. Start with the emotional lane that fits you now. Choose The Goblin Emperor if you want warmth. Choose the Curse of Chalion if you want wisdom. Choose the Lies of Lamora if you want motion. Choose the City of Brass if you want a larger world with a trilogy path. After that, let your response decide the next step. This matters because many adults do not quit fantasy because fantasy is bad. They quit because they pick too big a commitment too soon. A single good first choice rebuilds trust. A giant pile of ambitious books can make reading feel like school again. The goal is not to prove you are a serious fantasy reader. The goal is to find the adult version of the feeling that made fantasy work for you in the first place. The Goblin Emperor, Catherine Addison. This is the gentlest adult fantasy bridge, with a humane tone, a focused court setting, and very low intimidation. If I had to make the decision simple, I would not tell every adult reader to start with the same book. I would give 3 lanes. For comfort and maturity, start with the Goblin Emperor, then try the Curse of Chalion. For pace and personality, start with the Lies of Lamora, then try the Name of the Wind if you are comfortable with the series caveat. For immersion and world texture, start with the City of Brass, then try Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell when you want something slower and more literary. That order respects the axis of this video, nostalgia to adult taste. It does not chase the biggest canon. It follows the feeling you are trying to recover and upgrade. The important point is that adult fantasy is not one thing. It can be kind, witty, reflective, political, historical, literary, or strange. Start with 1 lane. Read 1 book with no pressure. Then let the next choice become obvious. That is how a childhood favorite becomes a doorway, not a standard you keep trying to copy.